Good evening and welcome. This is the People's Platform. Our topic of discussion tonight is mainstreaming the discourse surrounding upholding justice and equity in transformative biodiversity governance. Our guest tonight is an award-winning environmental scientist and a public policy advocate, Rohan Pethiagoda. Good evening and welcome to the show.
Hi Sonali, thank you.
Lovely to have you here. To start off tonight's discussion, speak to us about the wildlife conservation, biodiversity landscape in Sri Lanka, given the fact that there is very little awareness at grassroots level and in general about the importance and the nexus of sustainable development and survival.
How many hours are you going to give us?
We'll have to stick to 40 minutes,
no,
unfortunately.
I kid. I think, you know, the thing is agriculture, being an agricultural country, we are dependent on biodiversity. Biodiversity is the mix of species, of landscapes, of ecosystems that keep our ecosphere, our biosphere alive. And so we are all children of this biodiversity. And utilizing this biodiversity is something that we depend on for our economic well-being. So if you think about the electricity that's powering our homes now is largely biodiversity driven, because about 40% of our national electricity production now comes from hydropower, for which you need viable rivers. You're dependent on rainfall, which in turn is dependent on climate change. It depends also on having your river catchments conserved and forested and so on. So at every level of our lives, whether for clean water or power or agriculture, we are dependent on biodiversity. But we pay very little attention to integrating biodiversity considerations into our national policy framework.
Right.
We don't have a government institution, for example, that's responsible for biodiversity research. We've got medical research, we've got agricultural research for tea, rubber, coconut, cardamom and so on, but not for biodiversity. So this is a problem that we have to pay attention to, because unless we can bring together the expertise we have in this country, and we have formidable expertise, there must be 200 excellent PhDs in Sri Lanka on biodiversity science, but there's no forum to bring them together to contribute to national policy. And this is a hugely important challenge. So I think the question you ask is timely. It's about how can we mainstream scientific thinking into managing biodiversity in a way that benefits biodiversity. We've got thousands of threatened species in the country, for example, and we've got no institutional framework for managing this. If I can just add, we have got a Department of Wildlife Conservation, but they have no mandate to conserve. They have a mandate only to protect. Now, there's a difference between those two concepts.
Sure.
Protect is, for example, when you establish a national park, you put a fence around it and you regulate what goes on inside. You can't cut down trees, you can't hunt animals, and so on. Conserve is when you actually have to pay attention. When a species, for example, is on the brink of extinction, you have to intervene with scientific management interventions to recover it from that brink, or it will disappear. There's about 130 species of trees, for example, in Sri Lanka, which no one has seen for a century. Have they gone, or are they out there somewhere? No one's really paying any money to look. Of course, there are fantastic people who are going and looking for these things. And there's a young man called Himesh Jayasinghe, for example, who's gone and found many of the species that we thought were extinct.
Right.
But unfortunately, he's self-funded. There's no real funding that goes into doing this kind of work. So an institutional framework is something that we need.
Speaking of institutional frameworks, there are multiple stakeholders vested with the task of ensuring wildlife protection, such as the Ministry of Agriculture, Wildlife and Forest Resource Conservation, Department of Wildlife Conservation, as you mentioned, Department of Forest Conservation. However, you're saying that despite the existence of these institutions, there is still a massive lacuna in the system.
Yes, because the institutions don't have a mandate to do the science. It's a bit like taking a patient into intensive care and then being told, rather than a surgeon operating on the head injury, you're going to get the security guard to kind of make sure the patient doesn't bleed to death in some way. We've got a huge disconnect between conservation agencies and science. There's no scientific. It's like saying you're going to not have a medical research institute in the country. We don't have a biodiversity research institute in this country. And when we tried to set one up in 2004, many of the environmental organizations opposed it, because they felt that it would be a mechanism for this so-called biopiracy, and that it met the same fate as the MCC, if you will, the same kind of rhetoric that brought down the MCC. 480 million valuable dollars lost to Sri Lanka. Right? Very similar in the case of the Biodiversity Institute, which also was through a debt forgiveness mechanism with the United States. But I mean, that's water under the bridge. The issue is that we do need a scientific institution, just like we have for the other areas of our economy which are science dependent, like agriculture and medicine.
Right.
We do need a scientific institution that will design the interventions that we need to save species and ecosystems that are at threat.
It is also incumbent upon the government to build a biodiversity framework or a wildlife conservation policy on the one hand, and also to ensure mechanisms through which this policy can be implemented. I mean, although this seems like a no-brainer, we don't see this being done. Getting the scientists meshed into the policy, and then from there the implementing mechanisms. How do you view this?
It's not as you say, it's a no-brainer, but at the same time it is difficult. I'll give you an example. I think everyone's familiar with the so-called elephant gathering at Mineria every year. Now, during the dry months in Mineria that precede the northeast monsoon, you get hundreds of elephants gathering in Mineria. The reason that happens is because during the dry months the water level in the tank goes down, and what used to be the tank bed breaks out in very lush growth of grass. The elephants gather there to feed on the grass during the dry season, so it's a huge source of nutrition for the elephants.
Right.
Now, if, like happened last year, the irrigation department doesn't drain the tank, because now we've got Moragakanda upstream of Mineria.
Okay.
Moragakanda last year had to generate hydroelectricity during the dry season. That water ends up in Mineria, and the water level of Mineria didn't go down, hence no grass, hence elephants starve. So this gathering of elephants now has dwindled to about 1/4 of what it was a few years ago. And this is hugely consequential, because people come from all over the world to see this gathering of elephants, the largest congregation of Asian elephants in the world. And we lose that opportunity, because now it's not just a conservation issue, it's an irrigation department issue, and they're very good people. They're very keyed into the need to look after the elephants. Okay. But they've got to then tie in with the CEB and how much water is released upstream, and then square it with the farmers who will demand that water. And the farmers then said they don't want the water because they didn't have the fertilizer, so everything got messed up.
Right.
And so getting to grips with something like this across the various sectors, agriculture, irrigation, electricity, and conservation, takes many arms of government, and there's no one coordinator to do that. I mean, everyone passes the buck, and it didn't happen last year. So elephants literally starved to death. There's a lot of young elephants that died, according to Dr. Prithviraj Fernando, who's like not just a national expert on elephants, but an international expert.
Yeah.
His talent is sought everywhere in the world except this country, funnily enough.
So government departments work in silos, and there is no sort of collated mechanism to compare notes, if you will, and get the job done.
Yes, but they try. The thing is, now the irrigation department last year was even talking to individual conservationists, saying, like, guide us on how to do this.
Right.
It's not that there's ill will or like not that they're being difficult or they do try.
Okay.
But if you had a coordinating mechanism that brought the stakeholders together, because this is a complex thing,
Right.
and it also plays into tourism, so that's another stakeholder agency that comes in,
Right.
because people come to see these animals. So you have a fairly complex web of institutions that need to be coordinated. At the moment they try to coordinate themselves voluntarily, and they do a reasonable job. Until last year things went wrong because it got just too complicated.
Sure.
But it's crying out for an easy solution,
Right.
rather than the silos of individual ministries trying to look after their own turf.
I'd like to bring in the public, the general public, into this equation, Mr. Pethiagoda, because we see that a majority, if not all, of the policies concerning environment, biodiversity, etc., follow a top-down approach. So the grassroots level farmers, fishermen, etc., are not consulted. So they're just given a policy and the policy just gets implemented. How do we bring in the general public? Because people are also interested, and with this increase in public consciousness over the past few months, which has been really promising for the country. We've seen how people are interested in knowing about their rights, their responsibilities, what they can do to make the planet better, if you will. How do we bring in this aspect so that we can start some maybe groups of people lobbying for certain rights? For example, we saw this with the Animal Welfare Bill, which impacts on cruelty to animals, etc. So speak to us about that aspect.
I think on the one side we need to be grateful that things are a lot better now than they were a generation ago.
Okay.
In the 1980s, when the Mahabali project, which was a huge disturbance, if you will, to the environment, I mean, it was a necessary development, but at the same time, in terms of environment, a massive interruption to environmental systems, building all these dams, opening up hundreds of thousands of hectares to agriculture, took a lot of care to try and make sure that environmental concerns were addressed.
Right.
But still, it was very top-down, because the country at that time wasn't very mature in terms of dealing with responding to an environmental challenge of that magnitude. In the 1980s and 90s, many things changed as a result, I think, of what was going to happen to Singaraja in the late 1970s. A lot of Singaraja, Kanneliya, Kottava, those forests were going to be deforested for plywood in that period. And an environmental movement sprang up under the guidance of people like Thilo Hoffmann and Sarath Kotagama, who fought to protect those forests successfully, as it turned out. And I think Kotagama pioneered the idea that conservation should move from being the domain of the urban English-speaking elite to the village. And he made that transition by organizing. He had this field ornithology group, which is technically a bird-watching group, but actually broad-based into a very big activist NGO. He developed a literature which was sent in local language, in Sinhala, which helped people become bird watchers or frog watchers or biodiversity lovers, and broad-based the idea that biodiversity is the common heritage of all of us and not just Colombo's thinkers. And now we have in Sri Lanka, we almost take it for granted that school children are hugely aware of what's going on in the biodiversity world. I mean, a lot of the research being done now in biodiversity in Sri Lanka is being done by young people who come from Galle. There's a very active group based in Hiare, near Galle, for example. I come across school children from schools out of Colombo quite often who are hugely talented. There's a young 11-year-old girl called Alosha living in Alavathagoda near Matale, who makes wonderful YouTube videos on marine biodiversity, for example. So this has now become like internationalized, if you will, across the country. And so I think the organizing of these young people into NGOs like the Young Zoologists Association and many other environmental associations across the country have been hugely beneficial. And now we've got activist voices embedded in society that are fighting for the rights of the environment. So I think we're in a much better place now than we were then, but government is what has not changed.
Right. So over the past few decades, the world has lost an overwhelming number of species due to deforestation, unethical human activity, climate change, short-sighted development. And bringing the conversation to Sri Lanka, we've had our fair share of short-sighted development projects. And we've had policymakers who've gone viral for saying things like, why do we need oxygen, for example. So speak to us about two areas which I'd like to juxtapose. On the one hand, we have this deeply entrenched culture of bribery, corruption, deal-making in Sri Lanka, unfortunately. That juxtaposed with the need for development and the need for ethical, sustainable development. How do we draw a balance?
So the fact that we have a corrupt government is something that is, I think, common to most developing countries. This is not uniquely Sri Lankan. It's something we've got to try and deal with, but it's nothing very special. I'm not saying it's okay. Of course it's not, but we've got to get used to it. The fact that government operates in an intellectual vacuum is an altogether different challenge. This we don't need, because Sri Lanka is not a stupid country. We've got clever people. And the irony is now, current president is the first president or head of state we've had since Henry Monk Mason Moore in 1948, who's got a university degree. I mean, it took us a long time to get there. And I'm not saying that's necessarily a good thing or a qualification. I'm just saying, hang on, there's something wrong. If you've got free education, 70 years of free education, and you can't get graduates into parliament, there's something deeply broken in our political system. And so I think it's a crisis of leadership that we have, as we saw from the intellectual defects of the president who fled, Mr. Rajapaksa. Disastrous policies based entirely on absolute ignorance, which you can't imagine, because in agriculture, for example, there's no excuse. The agriculture department's, full of PhDs who are very clever at doing agriculture, but one man sitting on top of them can mess it up by dictating policy from the armchair based on ignorance or superstition or ideology. So that is our lot to bear. It's our political cross to carry.
But environmental litigation has a key role to play in this, in combating this. And if we tie into this the concept of climate justice, Sri Lanka was one of the 195 signatories to the Paris Agreement. But again, that was just a document which was signed, and that's it. I mean, it never really trickled down to the people. Nobody knows what we're meant to do as a result of having signed it. So similarly, we have these documents that a few guys go overseas and sign, they have a trip, and then they come back, or they submit a report every few years, and that's about it. So what do we do?
So I think we've got to be fair. There are some of these UN-led initiatives to which we sign up, which really deliver. I think the Millennium Development Goals, for example, which we signed up to, we really did deliver on. The Montreal Agreement we signed in the 1980s, we did deliver on. So we've been successfully delivering on some of these things. On some of them, we don't think they're really relevant. We sign up to them just because we think it's fashionable, or somebody who went to the meeting advised the government to sign up to them.
Right.
Now I think we've moved away from this idea.
Sure.
We were very courageous, I think, in not signing up to the Nagoya Protocol, which came up to us, and we seem to have dodged that. It's a complicated story, so I won't go into it, but we do duck having to sign up to some of these things.
Okay.
So the ones we do sign up to, sometimes we don't know entirely what we are committing to.
Right.
The Convention on Biological Diversity, we signed up in 1992, 30 years ago. We've done nothing with it because I think no one knows really what to do with it, how to make it work for Sri Lanka.
Right.
So a lot of these things we commit to because it's a fashion, or we go with the herd, and then we find that there's nothing relevant to us. So climate change for us also is hugely consequential because our agriculture depends so much on a rain-fed climate.
Yeah.
The tea industry, for example, is entirely climate dependent.
Right.
So I think if you look at the way in which climate is changing at the moment, for example, this steady failure of the southwest monsoon, we've had a decline in rainfall in the Norelia region, for example, of 20% in the last century. That's a lot of water we're not getting. When I was a schoolboy, we were taught that Waterville was the wettest place in the country. It no longer is. So climate at the local level is changing. How do we respond to that? We respond by making information available to people.
Right.
But here is where our institutions let us down, because the meteorological department has climate monitoring stations everywhere in the country, but the data is private to them. We pay our taxes to them to gather the data, but we can't use the data for agriculture, for example. You've got to buy it from them, and they charge you an arm and a leg.
Oh, okay.
It's the same thing with the wildlife department and elephant tracking data. Now, they've got collared elephants, which we can use to look at elephant movements, for example, to manage farming communities, but that again is proprietary information, and it's not available to the public or even to scientists to analyze.
Really?
So government sits on huge bodies of data which it doesn't share with the people who are the owners of the data, because we are paying for it, and then they don't share it.
I mean, the Right to Information Act dictates otherwise. So this is
yes, but then you've got to go and demand it and fight your way through it. But this is stuff that should be on a website that anyone can download.
Absolutely. Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much. We're going for a short commercial break. We'll be right back.
COVID-19 සඳහා ආරක්ෂිත පියවර. ජනයා වැඩි වශයෙන් සිටින ස්ථානයන්හි ගැවසීම මගහරින්න. රෝගය ආසාදිත පුද්ගලයන් හමුවීමට නොයන්න. මුහුණ, මුඛය, නාසය සහ ඇස් ඇල්ලීමෙන් වළකින්න. අනවශ්‍ය ගමන් බිමන් යෑමෙන් වළකින්න. මුඛාවරණය ඉදිරිපස ඇල්ලීමෙන් වළකින්න.
A brand new year, a year of hope, a year of aspirations and people looking for inspiration.
Our software engineers, our IT expertise are, not seconding to anyone.
A proper investigation led by the CID. This will be swept under the carpet.
Understanding about the stock market, the fundamentals, the economy, that is very important.
Entire ownership of this reclaimed land as well as the governance of Port City are all under the government of Sri Lanka.
No planet, no people, no business.
Yes.
And this is the simple thing about Biznomics.
Your weekend's most profitable 60 minutes. Biznomics, Saturday and Sunday at 5 p.m.
Welcome back to the People's Platform. We're in conversation with award-winning environmental scientist and public policy advocate Rohan Pethigoda. You also, interestingly, have a few animals, insects, frogs, a dragonfly, several fish named after you. I'm sorry, I think it's interesting for the viewers. Okay, so let's get into the solutions, Mr. Pethigoda. We highlighted quite a few issues surrounding this area of biodiversity conservation. Speak to us about the solutions or recommendations that you have for the prevailing human-elephant conflict.
So first off, I'm not an expert on elephants, so I want to be careful to say that there are people like Dr. Preeti Viraj and
yes.
Dr. Sumit Pilapitiya, for example, who've invested their whole lives on elephant conservation, who are brilliant at doing this. But there again, I think to a large extent there are fundamental policy issues that need to be decided. For example, the biggest capital expenditure of the Wildlife Department is on electric fences. They got last year, I think, ₹1 billion for electric fences. That's a lot of money in their terms.
Okay.
And where you plant these fences is a scientific question.
Right.
The orthodox remedy has been to plant the fences so that you prevent the elephants from leaving protected areas.
Okay.
So you surround protected areas with fences. This doesn't work very well because apparently the males are able to circumvent the fences. The females and young ones can be isolated behind a fence with diminished resources of food, for example, and literally starve to death. So you're not solving the problem because most of the agricultural problems stem from male elephants, which tend to be the wanderers. So whether you should put the fence around the forest or put the fence around the farm is a fundamental policy question. And scientists, I think, are heavily weighed in terms of fencing the farm, protecting the farm from elephants rather than preventing or rather than locking the elephants up in the forest.
Okay.
Because elephants are naturally wandering animals. And you don't really solve the problem with a fence apparently because the males get around the fence regardless. So the institutions working with the scientists is the way forward to solve the problem, to try and get the best advice and also to educate the farmers on what they can expect in terms of solving the problem, because we're losing hundreds of elephants and dozens of farmers every year, and this is a very cruel outcome to a conservation problem. So I think, I'm not saying it can be solved because our human population density is very strong now, and there's a lot of farmers living in area that has traditionally been inhabited by elephants, so this conflict is not going to disappear, but it certainly can be made less violent than it is now.
Right. Just to quote Dr. Prithviraj et al., over 14,500 incidents of human-elephant conflict were reported between 2010 and 2019. Also, Mr. Pethiyagoda, coming back to policy implementation, something about Sri Lanka is that we sort of believe in individuals and not institutions. So we don't really have proper frameworks and institutions in place. How can we go about strengthening our institutions so that we can ensure that the institutions can enable a system of conserving wildlife, biodiversity, all of this?
So institutions in every country have their limitations. I think this is, even in the West you see this problem in developed countries. In Sri Lanka, I think we are particularly disabled because the institutions throughout government have been weighed down by the need to employ more and more people. So you're carrying a lot of dead weight in most of these institutions, amongst a really dedicated core of officers that are really good.
Right.
If you go to national parks now, very often the park wardens are very high quality people, highly dedicated, they work hard. They might make bad decisions, but they really are committed. And in every institution, government institution that I've worked in quite a few, I've found that the institution itself is very strong.
Okay.
It is just that political interference usually weakens it, because you kill the spirit of the institution by getting weak management and so on. We don't also pay enough to get people into these institutions. Because when you consider someone with the same qualifications working in, for example, the Wildlife Department or the Forest Department, and in a university as maybe a senior lecturer, the university people get paid twice as much and probably get much better benefits like housing and so on sometimes. So I think we don't have a rational way of approaching this because our focus has been more and more employment in government. So I think smaller, tougher, more flexible government departments is one way to solve the problem. That's my experience of working in government. And sometimes it just becomes useless because the bigger government gets, the more drive there is, for example, for ministers and MPs to try and squeeze in the people from the electorate into the payroll. And then you get restrictions coming from the Treasury or the President's office saying you can't do that, and it just clogs up the whole department and its dynamism. So I think institutions, we're talking about structural reform in the country, and institutional reform is a big part of that. We have to do that.
According to the World Economic Forum's 2020 Global Risk Report, loss of biodiversity is one of the top 5 threats humanity will face in the next 10 years. This is insane. So there's a direct nexus between, again, wildlife conservation and the continuity of humanity. Speak to us about how we can bring in citizen engagement to lobby for environmental conservation and protection.
I think citizens do a pretty good job as it is. Whenever you see a threat to the environment that citizens perceive, they tend to get out there and protest.
Sure.
This happens very often with development projects, for example.
The Umawe project, for example.
Misguided, but nevertheless, there is protest. I don't think that's the solution, though. I think the bigger solution is to really look at how we can solve the core problems. If you look at our conservation objectives over the past decade, we have, in Sri Lanka, we're supposed to have about 3,000 species of flowering plants. Almost half of those are considered to be threatened with extinction.
Right.
More than 1,400 species. About 300 of them, 300 species, are considered to be critically endangered, on the brink of extinction. What are we doing about it? We make up these things called red lists, and we publish them, waste a lot of paper doing so.
Okay.
But there's nothing done on the ground level to protect any of those species. Most people in the conservation agencies, with the Forest Department, the Wildlife Department, wouldn't even know where those species grow.
Okay.
Because the scientists who are doing that work are disconnected from the agencies whose job it is to conserve the species.
Right.
So the need to integrate science on the one hand with conservation activist agencies on the other, I think is hugely important. We've been trying to do this for decades and it hasn't really worked.
Where's the gap?
The gap, I think, is in trust. The institutions don't trust the scientists for whatever reason, or don't feel it's important to trust the scientists, and the scientists have contempt for the institutions, which they feel, they're not interested.
Right.
So bringing these two fields together, I think, is consequential.
Also, Mr. Pethiagoda, speak to us about this concept that you raised just before the show about debt for nature swap to reduce some of Sri Lanka's foreign debt. Sri Lanka is going through its worst economic crisis. Yet, speak to us about this concept, because I think it's new to our viewers. We haven't raised this issue before. So speak to us about the implications and what it entails.
I'd explain this by saying, for example, out of the $40 billion of debt that Sri Lanka has got, more than 40 billion, say, for example, you take 1 billion of that debt, which we can't pay back now, and we go to the creditor, or somebody goes to the creditor and says, look, we'll offer you $600 million for that $1 billion worth of debt. And the creditor sells that debt to that agency, whoever goes and bids for it. The agency then goes, for example, to a green investment fund, because there are investment funds which want a green dividend, some benefit to conservation, for example, or biodiversity or the environment from their investment, and says, look, if we can sell this to you for $700 million, we'll use the 100 million extra to achieve some conservation goals in Sri Lanka. So there's a conservation dividend.
Right.
$100 million is a lot of money. I don't know how the arithmetic will work, because there's no plan at the moment, but this is being explored, for example, by the Asian Development Bank, the UNDP, and several key individuals in Sri Lanka, and they're doing a fantastic job. And for example, if you think Sri Lanka's exclusive economic zone, the marine economic zone, is about 8 times the size of the country itself. It's huge. So if we can come up, for example, with a plan, maybe including an Institute of Oceanography for the country, that will set aside, for example, conservation areas within the economic zone, manage fisheries, manage shipping and conflict with whales, for example, manage tourism in the marine zone. There's so much economic potential out there, but we don't have a management system. So we can ask for a management system as a dividend for that debt transaction. And for this we need to get maybe a big worldwide NGO to come and get involved. We almost certainly would. We'd have to get an underwriting bank. For example, a project like this was done in Belize by Credit Suisse and the Nature Conservancy, which is a big American NGO. We need to get those people interested. But they, on their side, are suspicious of Sri Lanka because we've got this anti-American streak in our blood. We rejected the Millennium Challenge Corporation, for example, $480 million, which would have sorted out traffic management in Sri Lanka in addition to many other problems, which carried no risk at all, but just because of some absolutely stupid politicians. This got thrown out, and now the money's gone to other countries. So the same thing might happen there. We've been very good at shooting ourselves in the foot when it comes to doing things like this, and the worry is that we'll do it again.
All right. I was reading through the Vilpattu judgment as research for this show, and I came across once again the Bulankulam judgment, where Justice Amarasinghe stated, "The organs of state are guardians to whom the people have committed the care and preservation of the resources of the people. This accords not only with the scheme of government set out in the Constitution, but also with the high and enlightened conceptions of the duties of our rulers in the efficient management of resources in the process of development." And the Vilpattu judgment goes on to, I think Justice Janak de Silva goes on to quote Buddhist scriptures, Hindu scriptures, and Islamic scriptures. I'll just read out one because this is so interesting. He quotes Justice C.G. Veeramantri in Tread Lightly on the Earth, Religion and the Environment and the Human Future, who cites the Quran. "Trusteeship of the universe is recognized in Islam, and any violation of it by man is accountable and subject to punishment. As the Quran states, it is He who made you trustees of the earth." In Sri Lanka, we see, Mr. Pettiagoda, how man has coexisted with nature for hundreds of years, and it's sad to see that we don't really care much anymore. I'm speaking about the top, the echelons of power, government. In conclusion, how must the government, since we have a new government now, how must the government now rethink its approach to sustainably managing environment, equity, justice?
In a crisis like we are now, that's not going to happen. That's the honest truth. Not for the next 5-10 years.
Okay.
I think the urgency now is to get food in the mouths of people, to get jobs back, to get the economy moving, and we're going to have to pay a price for that. And part of that price will come from the environment. Whether we like it or not, that's going to be the case. If you look, for example, at the problem of cooking gas, LPG, we have $500 million going out of the country to bring LPG every year. What's wrong with charcoal? Many of us have shifted to charcoal. My own house shifted to charcoal about 3 months ago. It works perfectly well. Now, if we grow our own fuel in Sri Lanka, we just need 20,000 hectares of land to do that. We've got 80,000 acres of hectares of plantation forestry already. There's a cost to the environment because people are going to complain and saying you're cutting down trees in order to grow firewood for charcoal. But isn't it better to do that and be carbon neutral than import gas and burn it? So we're going to have to make compromises like this in terms of policy going forward. And some of this is going to be unpleasant. People are not going to be happy with it. It's going to look like it's environmentally unfriendly. But actually, I think if we balance our books properly, we'll see that we can achieve quite a lot and still be good environmental citizens and at the same time be responsible financial citizens, because we can't depend on the world for charity forever.
Okay. And how must the education system also inculcate in children a love for nature and the protection of natural resources, fauna and flora?
I think that's been done. I don't see a problem there. The awareness amongst the young generation, the under 20s, about nature is just fantastic in this country. You don't see it in many other countries. Children are very aware of what's going on.
Okay, fantastic. At least some wins. All right, thank you so much, Mr. Rohan Petiagoda. Thank you for joining this discussion.
You're welcome.
Thank you for watching us. We'll see you again on Monday with the Single edition of the People's Platform. Have a safe weekend. Good night. And we're done.
Good.